Why don't we start with telling me your name, a little bit of your background, and any research that you've worked on.
So I'm Michelle Hilscher, and I have a PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto. I went there from my undergrad through to the end of my dissertation. And what I studied was higher cognition, I guess, if we wanted to group all of my topics of interest under one umbrella. And that's what really got my interest going about human behavior. And then I moved into something that was related to responding to information for my dissertation, and that was looking at how people judge the validity or the truth value of arguments. And I was looking at the logical syllogism, which is quite abstract. A logical syllogism is a three-part argument, and what you can do is pipe in information, and it can tell you things about the world that may not actually mesh with your belief system. So I could give you a logical syllogism that says, all cats are mammals. It's pretty neutral. That's something we can believe. The next premise could be something along the lines of all mammals are friendly. Okay, maybe we can't quite believe that, but it's not exactly offensive, and it may not necessarily be something that raises a red flag. Then that conclusion could be that all cats are friendly. I mean, maybe that's something that really does not jibe with how you see the world. It is not consistent with your beliefs. And yet, I'm asking you to tell me if the argument is valid. And it is. So you have to, in fact, disentangle your belief system from the logical validity of the argument.
So my name is Christopher Ling, and I did my PhD in business administration at the University of South Carolina. And within business administration, I studied marketing. So looking in marketing, I looked at the consumer level. So I looked at how the consumer thinks, feels, and behaves, from awareness of a product all the way to consumption and disposal, the entire process. So my research interests within consumer behavior really focus on consumer misbehavior. So I look at the ways in which consumers kind of deviate from accepted social norms. So when you think about this, you might think about, for example, a customer who wants to cut in front of someone in a line, to maybe more serious things such as shoplifting, so that's stealing something from a retail location, to things like wardrobing, so a customer wearing an item and then returning it to a store later on. I'm also interested in emotions and how emotions can play a role in purchasing products, and I'm interested in self-control, as well as judgment and decision-making, which is a big area within marketing.
My name is Shannon O'Malley. I have a PhD in cognitive psychology. Throughout my graduate work, I studied visual word processing, which is really just a fancy way of saying reading. It's really what we're interested in is how people translate letters on a page to sound and to meaning. And in my work, I was really interested in what the factors are that influence this process. So how does things like attention or intention, or even something as simple as the list of words that you're reading, how does that makeup impact how you're processing those words? So oftentimes we would be presenting words that are very familiar, and we would insert things like that we called non-words, which are pronounceable words that aren't really words yet. So if you could imagine them in the real world, they would simply be unfamiliar words, a word you haven't seen before. So a lot of people will think of Harry Potter. The first time you read Harry Potter, you encounter all of these strange words that you have never read before. That first time you read it, it's a non-word to you, and then it becomes a word. So it establishes, you understand what the sound is, and eventually you attach meaning to it. When you insert these words into a longer list, people change how they read. People change how they're processing that information. That's a very small, subtle change that we make to the environment that has an actual big impact in terms of how you're processing information. Understanding that is so critical to the work we do at BEworks, where we're often changing things in the environment. In things like an online optimization project, we're changing where the pricing is on a page, how you're phrasing information before you see the pricing, and looking at how that impacts purchase behavior.
My name's Ada. I have a PhD in psychology, but specifically cognitive neuroscience from the University of Toronto. And then after that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at York University. And then after that, I ended up at BEworks. I was one of those people who got really interested into a bunch of research topics, a bunch of research fields, So I was a little bit of a jack of all trades type person. My main line of research when I was doing my PhD was actually looking at how people physically interact with the real world. So coming down to things like, well, how do people reach out and grasp a coffee cup, grasp something that's on a shelf, and how does the environment influence the way that people move their arm, and how is that reflected in the neural mechanisms? So another word to say that is the brain activity that's involved to drive this kind of behavior.
My name is Kazunaga Matsuki. Usually people call me Kaz or Kazu. I have a PhD in psychology from University of Western Ontario. I originally came from Japan, and I went to the United States for my undergrad, and I came to Canada for graduate school. And because of that personal history, I was really interested in language and how people try to use it, understand it, process it. And that's why I went into the field of psycholinguistics. Psycholinguistics is basically the discipline where we try to understand how people understand language and how people understand words within a sentence context. And I'm interested in this type of research because we use language every day. Yet when you look at from the scientific perspective, it's filled with a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges has to do with ambiguity. There's an infinite way of expressing the same things, but some way of expressing the same concepts can lead to processing difficulty, misunderstanding. And what my research tried to do is to understand the context at which that happens. What sort of information leads into people either resolving ambiguity or misunderstanding.
Use an example to give me an interesting finding.
My dissertation focused on social rejection. So this was something that I was fascinated with all through my master's. And so going into my PhD, I really wanted to know more about social rejection because it's a huge area within the marketing literature. I wanted to see how can I contribute to that literature. And so looking at social rejection, I learned that it's something that people feel quite often. So during the day, we might ask a friend if they want to have lunch with us, and they say, no, I can't have lunch with us. That's an example of feeling socially rejected. So social rejection is the process of feeling a lack of human connection, either by being alone, isolated, or outright rejected. And so I was interested in seeing how social rejection could affect shoplifting behavior. And so what I found fascinating about shoplifting was that 60% of consumers have shoplifted at some point in their lives. And if you look at who has shoplifted in, let's say, the past year, 1 in 11 people have shoplifted in the past year. And so the literature on shoplifting looked at what types of factors affect shoplifting. So they really focused on demographic variables. And they looked at age, they looked at gender, they looked at race. And they found some findings. So we know, for example, that adolescents are the most likely to shoplift. And then as age increases, shoplifting rates decrease. But overall, we weren't very good at predicting different things which might affect shoplifting behavior. And so with my research, we looked at how might social rejection affect people's intention to shoplift. And we found that for people who have shoplifted before, if they've been socially rejected, that's going to trigger them to shoplift in the near future. So if they're in a retail location and they've just been socially rejected, they're going to be more likely to shoplift. And so this type of work has implications for what we do at BEworks because it speaks to the fact that these social influence insights can affect the way in which consumers decide to purchase or even steal products and what that might do for companies.
I was looking at what's called visual metaphor, and it's really interesting because it was visual metaphor that was also intermixed with product design. So I actually was in Holland for 4 months. I lived in Delft, and I worked at the technical university there with a team of industrial designers. And they were really curious about the psychology of product design and the experience of using products. And so what they wanted to explore was when you build a product that looks like something that it's not, what that does to the experience of the user. And so they looked at one type of product. I can give you an example. It was called the Senseo Crema. It's an espresso machine essentially. And he leans forward. He's blue and he's inclined towards you. And as the coffee is brewed, he is supposed to look like a butler. He's supposed to give you the feeling that this is a luxurious experience. So that's an inherent metaphor there. And we would say it's kind of an experiential metaphor. It doesn't relate to the way that the machine is used. That was one category of metaphor in product design. The other category was what we call functional metaphors. And that's where the visual metaphor cues how you use the product. An example would be a little cake knife that looks like an alligator, and the teeth are these little tiny alligator teeth. And so it kind of cues you into the fact that, oh, the alligator's taking a bite out of the cake. And so the question is, what's the difference, how people experience the product? And we found very distinct differences. In fact, it seemed like when you're looking at a product that has a functional metaphor cueing its use, that might be something that's a little bit longer lasting. So it's actually something that you're going to be aware of for longer over time than something that's experiential and not tied into the use.
What do you love about science, and why is the scientific method important?
I've always been curious about the world. I've always wanted to understand it, and in particular, I've always wanted to understand people. It sounds a little bit weird to say, but I've always found people and the way they behave to be strange. We do weird stuff all the time, and lots of people notice it and they just kind of get used to it. But there's this sort of special class of people, psychologists typically go into behavioral science, who notice it and think, what's the deal with that? All right, we got to figure this out. And the best way we have to figure that out is science, is to use the scientific method so that we can actually understand what is up with all these weird little quirks that we all have.
The scientific method is not secret sauce. The scientific method is something that allows you to, share ideas on an even plane.
It is true that intuition does work, but it doesn't always. So there's things like confirmation biases. So you always look for things to support your initial belief. So if you think that something's working, you might, look for evidence to support that belief and just kind of ignore the things that are telling you that it's not working. The scientific method, it pushes us to go beyond that. It's a systematic collection of data. It's unbiased.
Why do you work at BEworks?
Why do I work at BEworks? So I'm going to go a little bit philosophical on this one. One of the things that I think is so interesting about BEworks is the role it plays between fundamental research and applied research. So most fields of science have fundamental research. So if you think of physics as an example, you have physicists who are doing that fundamental research in the lab under ideal conditions, what happens in a vacuum.